This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Welcome everyone to the 100th episode of the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. So thank you all for listening, watching and sharing the podcast so that we could get to where we are today. 100 episodes, 100 diverse voices, and more voices continue to be shared on an international scale. My name is Angelica Solinska. I'm your host and the founder of the Voice of Early Childhood. And in this episode, we are talking about slow pedagogy and the child's voice mainly, and a lot more as well. Now, this episode is very special for several reasons. Firstly, because we have Professor Alison Clark with us. Thank you very much, Alison, for coming on to share your voice on the Voice of Early Childhood.
My pleasure, and congratulations, Angelica, on your 100th episode. Very special.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, it really is. And it really is an honour to have you here sharing your voice, Alison. So, and then this is the second reason why this 100th episode why this episode is so special, because it is the 100th episode, as I mentioned, and the fact that we have Alison as our special guest, and that, you know, it's all interlinked here, and it will all become clearer as I continue. So there's a few things that I want to mention. So firstly, I'll give our listeners and viewers more of an introduction to your work, Alison. So Professor Alison Clark is an academic and consultant, and her work and role currently is a Professor of Early Childhood Education at the University of South Eastern Norway. So really important role, and you've done so much work, and you know, you've got so many and had so many very acclaimed kind of roles. But what I know you most well for, Alison, is, and I'm sure this is similar to those educators who've been in the field of early childhood for maybe 10 plus years, is your work advocating for the voice of the child through your pioneering research with Professor Peter Moss on the Mosaic Approach. For those that aren't familiar, and I'm sure Alison will tell us more, the Mosaic Approach is a participatory multimethod approach of listening to young children's voices within qualitative research. So, like I said, I'm sure we'll unpick further, and you've got lots to say about that. But more recently, your work on slow knowledge and the unhurried child is what those who are less familiar with your work might know you for currently. But for me personally, your work on the Mosaic Approach has really ignited that spark within me, which I still carry with me to this day, 12 years on from my undergraduate early years degree, when I first learned about the Mosaic Approach. And importantly, this is what has led me to be so passionate about children's rights, participatory research methods, ethical research with children, and the child's voice. And this is what ultimately led me to create the Voice of Early Childhood, all about sharing the diverse voices of the early childhood community, including giving voice to our youngest children through their educators, through researchers and family members and other professionals, and ultimately really advocating for the voice of the child and the wider early childhood community as well. So now that I've really set the scene, where should we begin then, Alison? I suppose it would make sense to hear how you got to where you are today with your work around slow pedagogy, which I'm sure stems from your interest and work on the theoretical, methodological, and the ethical aspects of young children's, that co-construction of knowledge using those visual methods, participatory methods, which we can begin to unpick. So would you like to give us, I guess, as much as possible, an overview?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Angelica. Well, yes, I try not to take too long. But so I was a primary school teacher back in the 1980s. And when I started doing research, I worked with the National Children's Bureau on a project around the Guardian Ad Litem service, which was around advocating for the voice of children within those very important legal proceedings. And that kind of was the first of my sort of official projects, really, around listening to children's views. Mm-hmm. And that led to a post at the Thomas Coram Research Unit, which is now part of University College London Institute of Education. And I had the opportunity to work with Professor Peter Moss on a project that was looking at how to include the views of the youngest children, so children under 5, in a review of a group of children and family services. And it was called The Voice of the Child, and it was linked to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it started in 1999. So we're over 25 years ago.
Yeah, wow.
So a long time. And at the time, the Voice of the Child, in terms of research, in terms of qualitative research, was not taken for granted, and particularly the voice of the youngest children. So several times over my career, I've needed to advocate for including young children's voices in research. And there's been a strong element of working with educators all the way through on the different projects. So the Mosaic Approach is the idea is to draw on the strengths of young children, to bring together expressive languages that play to their strengths, and use the phrase children as experts in their own lives. That phrase has been used very widely. I didn't invent it, but I heard it first from a Danish sociologist, Ola Langsted, and it was in a piece that I'd read of his work. But I found it very useful, almost like a key that opens a door to people and say, "Oh, yeah, actually, maybe we're missing a trick if we don't ask the children what they think." And I remember a conversation in a later project with a headmaster of an inner city school in London, and I was working on a subsequent study called Living Spaces. And he said to me, "Oh, do you know what? I've never thought of children as experts in their own lives." And it was like, yeah, okay, our education system is not geared up to that. It still doesn't really see children as having such valuable insights into their own learning. So my work on listening then has gone through several different phases, including some work with the Department for Education at the time, and then has more recently led to this whole body of work on thinking about the relationship with time and the need to advocate for a less hurried, less pressured early childhood education.
So there's links there really between listening and slowing down, because inherently in having to listen to young children, we do as adults need to slow down it, because there are so many ways of listening to young children. I guess this reminds you of the 100 Languages by Loris Malaguzzi, and incorporated in very much so in the Reggio Emilia approach. And it is about taking that step back, isn't it? And just giving that space and time. And something that I often talk about is also even that time and space for silence, because that also is a form of listening too.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that link with Reggio Emilia has been important all through my career. So, and it's obviously something that Professor Peter Moss, my colleague who I've worked with for many years, Peter is a great advocate for Reggio Emilia and the preschools there and their particular pedagogy. And I just read something today, actually, was talking about one of the educators there, Via Vecchi, who for many years was a taglierista, so running the art studio and in the Diana School. And I was reading about how she was saying how to give time for things to move from a technique for children to being a language for children. And I think that's really interesting. So I think maybe we're better at giving children different techniques, which, could be picked up quite quickly. But if we're giving children expressive languages, then they need time to develop those skills. That isn't an instant thing, and it's not necessarily something that can be easily measured. And I think this has been another kind of strand through my work, is to advocate for creativity, the value of creativity, or value of empathy, the things that are not going to show up on a tick sheet, but can be going to be really important for 21st century citizens.
And we do often hear that debate between school readiness versus an academic readiness, versus having those life skills and being ready to be a citizen of this world. And what does that even mean? And like you say, 21st century skills, which are always adapting, developing, changing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, it's an increasingly uncertain world. And I think, we're in education, we need to be thinking more around, okay, how can we equip children for a future that we as adults now don't really know the details of? So I think things like to be able to think for themselves, to be problem solvers, to be critical thinkers, these are going to be really important skills. And children aren't going to pick those up, and young children aren't going to pick them up if they don't have a curriculum that emphasizes play. They need to learn these skills for themselves, and they need to have the opportunity to develop those skills over time.
And what I've just noted down from what you've just been saying is it seems to me that slow pedagogy really honors childhood in its own right, but also prepares children for the future and developing those 21st century skills.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So the work on slow pedagogies has led to a 2-year study that was funded by the Froebel Trust.
Okay.
So Froebel Trust supports practitioners and researchers who are interested in a sort of contemporary look at Froebel's ideas. Froebel, who is credited with developing the first kindergarten, and some of those Froebelian principles start with valuing childhood in its own right, and also a strong emphasis on a very skillful role of the educator, and yes, so this 2-year study was my chance to kind of think about how can we look again at how we use time in early childhood, because I think it's almost an overlooked resource. Think to my teacher training, and I don't remember anybody really talking to me about time and how we work with time, and how we can use it to its full potential for how can we make sure that we're making the best use of children's time. So all these kind of questions I don't remember coming up in my teacher training or in my early teaching experience. But I think the other side of it is thinking just how rushed and busy and over and pressured the whole kind of early childhood sector is. And thinking about what are the things that we can reclaim from early childhood traditions, which is not just about Froebel's work, but it's around the sort of the early childhood practice that we know makes sense and has the privileging of play, are the things that we can stand up for, that will actually make it a more enjoyable sector to work in for educators, as well as using making it the best it can be for young children.
Hiya, just a really quick message from me. I'd really love to ask for a little favor from those listening and watching. So wherever you're listening, wherever you're watching on, whatever platform it is, please do hit the subscribe button. This really, really helps the Voice of Early Childhood to continue putting out those thought-provoking episodes and continue making sure that we share those diverse voices and give you the topics and guests that you want to hear from. And for those of you who already subscribe, thank you very much. This helps so much. And everyone, thank you for listening, watching, and supporting the Voice of Early Childhood. I think it really resonates with me, you saying we've never really, in your training, you don't remember really coming across the concept of time and I was going to say kind of time management, if anything, but nothing,
Mm.
deeper than that. But even I don't remember any kind of anything around how do you manage your time as a practitioner or teacher, not even that, which is a
No.
very basic thing, that we hear in
Yeah.
a lot of other training,
Yeah.
let alone, like, as you said, how do we make the most of children's time? It's not just about the adults' time that we seem to value so, so much more. And that shows through everything, including children in parent family circumstances when children are always rushed through routines, in the setting as well, from one thing to another. And that just, I guess, demonstrates that we don't value children's time, and ultimately we don't seem to value children as much as we value adults.
Yeah.
It's a bigger children's rights, I think, perspective,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. So one of the early things that I read around thinking around slow was a book called In Praise of Slow by Carl Honoré. And so he was looking at the slow movement, which began in the 1980s, thinking about the relationship with food in Italy.
Okay.
And it was a kind of challenge to a kind of fast food culture. And the slow movement has then gone on and looked at other areas. For example, you might slow fashion is kind of talked about quite in the media, a sort of a challenge to the kind of buy it cheap, throw it away culture, and or send it back. And so in Carl Honoré, one of the catalysts for him as a young father was what he described as the 1 minute bedtime story.
Okay.
And he found himself, because of the sort of pressures of being a parent, that he was always trying to make story time as short as possible. And then, that's kind of sense of him backing out the bedroom door and his little voice saying, no, more stories, more stories. So he kind of then thought, oh, hang on a minute, what am I doing? Why am I wanting to make story time as short as possible? What am I missing here? And that was kind of one of the catalysts for his book. And I think that connects with a very current issue, which is around the value of reading to children. So Frank Cottrell Boyce, Children's Laureate, has just been launching a reading rights campaign. And in January 2025. And he is talking around just the importance of children being read to, and raising concern about the number of children that are starting school who haven't been read to. And yes, I think that kind of, it's something that we can give to young children in the early years, that kind of privilege of just enjoying a story together and enjoying hearing a story again. And I'm really sort of caught up with this idea of giving young children more opportunities to revisit the things that they love, and not to see that as a waste of time. So I think this question of what is seen as a waste and who is telling us it's a waste is really important. And I think children being able to hear things again, to play with the same toy over time, is not necessarily a waste of their time. And I think there is a sort of a cognitive value in that, being able to revisit these ideas, strengthen those connections. But sometimes in our education system, it's always about the fast forward. And I think we need to challenge that.
Yeah, it's always about the next step, the learning outcome.
Yeah.
And I guess when you say the cognitive benefits, what comes to mind that is as close as linked to this I can think of currently is probably schematic play, where we are encouraged as educators to provide children with opportunities to repeat their behaviors that they're kind of fascinated and things that they're fascinated by. But again, in schematic play, in the education around that, in materials and CPD, I've not come across that concept of time and slowing down, like the way that you talk about and the way that we're talking about now. So it's almost like that that we do have practices where we should be slowing down, and we practice, these things, but we've kind of not, and educators have not made that connection. And even in training educators and teachers, we haven't made that explicit connection between slowing down and schematic play, for instance, and everything else that you're talking about here.
Yeah, I think so. So I think part of my work has been around raising these issues and trying to make these connections explicit. And some of those connections, other people will be much better placed than me to kind of make that link. But for example, with outdoor play and relationship with nature, there's been a lot of research over many years about the importance of children gaining a sense of belonging through a sort of regular visit to outdoor play. I remember reading an article many years ago by Tim Waller around a weekly visit to a particular park with children and how they built up those connections, and how they begin to story a place. And that's a very key idea. And it's what I saw most recently. I was invited to visit educators in Australia, and I was visiting an early years setting that had a weekly, what they called bush kinder, and basically it was a slow walk. You're walking at the pace of the youngest children to a wooded area where they were playing over time. It was a place of reading stories, of collecting twigs. It was a sort of very gentle time in the week. But the children became familiar over time with that environment. And I think we can see that in many different forms within early years practice. So with forest kindergartens, for example. But I think the what could be called the temporal side of this. So we hear a lot about sort of spatial thinking, but I think there's something around the relationship with time as well here. So, and that's connected with children's sense of belonging and well-being.
That's you bring up some really interesting things. Story a place, you said. I haven't heard of that expression before.
Yeah, well, I worked for several years with the Open University, and I worked with a team in childhood studies with sociologists and geographers and other people. And this idea of a space being turned into a place by story is a sort of familiar idea there. And I kind of think, it has a lot of implications for thinking about young children and their relationship with the environment. And it ties in with some of my earlier research, where working with the Mosaic Approach, where children would take me around an outdoor space and they would then tell me things that had happened in that space. Going right back to the first to the first project, with a child telling me about where he went to listen to his magic radio. So it was just occasionally in my work, I've seen these glimpses about how children story a space into a place. And that obviously we need to tune in order to do that, and kind of learn how to kind of step back a bit from our first impressions in order to find out what your young children are. Yeah. How they bring their imagination to what they do.
And that, I guess that makes sense when we think about, in terms of, I guess, the adult perspective, that every place has a story. And therefore every space has the potential to have a story. And we do connect ourselves to places and spaces, which become places, through our memories of these places, and therefore the stories that we begin to tell through these spaces and begin to associate with.
Yeah, I think it's an important role of an early childhood setting is how we can gather those stories and incorporate different children and family into that as new members join an early years community. So I had a lovely example. Again, this is a New Zealand example of where the setting gathered photographs of families over time who had been part of the setting, but they kept those photographs up. So if a younger member of the same family came along, they would be there. But they also did that with members of staff. So even when a member of staff had left, there was still a visual memory of that member of staff. And it was like, oh, blimey, that's kind of that. I think that's very special, because that's part of how you hold a memory of a learning community over time that isn't just interested in the immediate present.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think so. I think that raises questions around how we gather a collective memory, how we make sure that's inclusive of children from a whole range of different cultures and backgrounds and abilities, and so that every child feels like they belong in this place and they see themselves in that place. And I think that's really important.
This is really going beyond what we talk about as, I guess, as a foundational level with educators who may be just quite new to practice or developing. And we talk about belonging. How do we allow children and families to feel like they belong in our setting? And a lot of the time we talk about the environment and what we can provide in terms of the resourcing and in terms of, I guess, books as well, photographs of families, things like that are pretty, I guess, basic, but we still need to encourage educators to do that. But this is really taking it a step further, so much of a step further, a leap further, I would say. And I think it shows just how much more training is required around all of this, because it's so much, belonging is so much deeper than a child has been able to see a picture of themselves and their family on the wall.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think going back to that question, the relationships that children form with members of staff. So in my first study, one of the girls I was working with took me to the staff photo board, and she asked her friend to take a photograph of her standing next to the board. And it turned out that on the board, the setting had decided to leave up a picture of one of the members of staff who was on maternity leave. And this particular little girl was really fond of this key worker, but she hadn't seen her for months and months and months. But actually, it was important that photo was still there and that she could kind of acknowledge its importance to her. So I think that it was that example that kind of opened my eyes a bit to, oh my goodness, yeah, children may have these connections that go beyond our expectations, And in developing the Mosaic Approach, I remember educators saying to me, oh, yes, this is about don't make assumptions. And that's a hard thing to do. And we can't stop doing it, really, because we always bring our own kind of ideas to situations. I think it's about being aware, oh, okay, let's just check what our assumptions are when we're working with young children.
And that requires an educator to be skilled in being reflective.
Yeah.
And that requires the educator to therefore slow down as well, themselves slow down in their thinking. Yeah,
I think so. So I think this whole question of how to help new educators to be able to incorporate their own ideas, their own childhood and background and thinking about how they've learnt themselves and how to bring that into their professional life is really key. So Froebel talks about the importance of freedom with guidance. And I think that requires a huge amount of skill to kind of know, okay, when should I be stepping in here? When do I need to bring my own knowledge into this situation, into this play situation, for example? When do I need to hold back? And yeah, we that requires great training and ongoing training.
Yeah, for sure. And you talk, whilst we're kind of talking about the educator, there are definitely links from a link between educator well-being and children's well-being as well to slowing down, isn't there? In terms of, you mentioned just in the kind of wider society about all of these effects of kind of slowing down from fashion to food, and there's so much more in terms of well-being too.
Yeah, and I think we need to do more research on looking at, okay, if we think again about the relationship with time and the pace and rhythm of the day, which is just one element of a slow pedagogy, then what are the potential benefits for educators? And I think at its best, what this could be about is actually allowing educators the freedom to be with children. This was one of the kind of key themes that came out in the 2-year study, this idea of freedom to be with children, which means you're kind of almost giving yourself permission and feeling that you have permission from from leaders and managers to actually be in that moment with children. And I think there's something in here about reclaiming some of the kind of just the joy of that. And I think we have a time in the sector when there are so many other pressures that if we can do something to sort of help people be able to enjoy more of the day. And this isn't going to solve some of the sort of ratio issues or the pay and other big challenges, but I think there is something here to be done to try and help bring back some of the fun and life and joy in the job.
And I guess this reminds you of the concept of just being present and in the moment as well. For the educator, that's really healthy. For the adult, that's really healthy, and obviously for the child as well. And we're modeling that for the child. And I guess children, actually, we don't really need to model it. Children are quite good at being present and in the moment. They're very good, in fact. And I guess that gets squashed by everything in later life. So it's almost actually the opposite. We need to learn from children. They are modeling that to us.
Yeah, I think so. So I think this the word presence is important, and attention, full attention. And these are all things that are becoming increasingly difficult. Maybe I think you're right. There's things that we can learn from young children about this that can kind of help us in our own sort of personal lives as well, really.
And you talk about you mentioned slow knowledge. Now, what does that actually mean? We've not really kind of defined that yet, I guess.
Yeah, no. So I guess, in the 2-year study, there were 4 themes that came out and which led on to thinking about slow knowledge. So the 4 themes were thinking around a slow pedagogy that gives opportunities to be with children, to be with ideas. This idea of giving children the opportunity to go off track. So rather than just to follow a script always with children, and we can see it in some academy schools where teachers are given a strict script to follow. And I think that's a complete opposite of a slow pedagogy, where you're open to things developing in a way you weren't expecting. So that doesn't mean you don't plan, but it means that you have that openness for something surprising to happen. So children to be able to go off track, to be able to dive deep with children. Okay. So quite a lot of my development work that's happened since the 2-year study, we've been looking at this connection between slow and deep. So rather than an education that is very shallow and gives children a very kind of limited way into ideas, that you're opening more opportunities for children to develop their ideas and go deeper. And a 4th idea was this idea of being able to take the longer view. So rather than everything being caught up in the immediate and the urgent, and there will be times when that has to happen, but it's also around in a slow pedagogy of valuing the things that develop over time. So taking the longer view. And all those elements seem to tie into, okay, so if we're working in this way, then what kind of knowledge does that lead to? And so I link this to this idea of slow knowledge. So slow knowledge, it's a term that I read about by an environmentalist called David Orr. And one of the things he says, he contrasts slow knowledge with fast knowledge. And so kind of fast knowledge is the kind of easily measured, quickly gained, shallow knowledge. And slow knowledge is these ideas of being able to go deeper. A slow knowledge can involve complex ideas rather than the very simple and straightforward. And he says, in one part, slow knowledge, it's very difficult to say. Slow knowledge is values the old. So he contrasts it to sort of fast knowledge that's only interested in the new.
Right. Okay.
So that's not to say that there won't be new insights, but it's actually not afraid to go back to ideas that have been around for decades and sometimes centuries.
And in a way, I know you said decades and centuries, but in a way also links to reflection, because reflection, you are going back to the past, even if it is just the past 5 minutes, you're reflecting on what has happened. Absolutely.
So I'm really interested in how, in very busy lives, how we can also help each other to be more reflective. And I think, the part of that is being able to make time to actually kind of, for example, read maybe notes that we've made, say, a month ago. I mean, I'm a great one for notebooks, but I don't necessarily go back and read what I've written. So it's like kind of, one of my challenges to myself is, okay, maybe look at one you wrote, those notes from September last year, and actually see what ideas you were thinking about professionally. And then, okay, how do you look at them now? How can you build on them, kind of thing? So, I think there are challenges in this for early childhood students, for new early years educators, and for, researchers and those who have been in the field for a long time.
Yes, definitely. And I was just thinking of students and CPD or mainly degree level or longer term qualifications, and actually how slow pedagogy has come about kind of more recently from your work, and you kind of bringing this to the forefront, bringing it to early years. And I have seen lectures within kind of undergraduate study around slow pedagogy and what does that mean, and it's kind of a one-off session, even if it is like a 4-hour session, but actually I feel like this slow pedagogy, slow knowledge, all of this needs to be infiltrated in everything that we do in early childhood, in our lives, really. A bit like, as we've coined that phrase, the golden thread that we've heard a lot, But it does seem like it needs to be throughout everything that we think and do, and not just there's this type of pedagogy. Like there's the Mosaic Approach, or for research, or there's the Forest School approach, or the Reggio Emilia approach, or Montessori, and you could pick and choose. Actually, yes, of course you can, but it just seems like this is more than an approach to kind of pick up and just place into your setting.
Yeah, I think it's more than a technique, as we were saying. I think it's more of a way of, so with the pedagogy, it's a way of teaching and learning, but I think it's something that can be applied across the life course. So I guess in my own learning, as I continue to learn and continue to teach, it's like, okay, so maybe what do these ideas have to say about the way that I take on new ideas? So, for example, one thing in that is about sometimes making the time to reread something. And that's hugely challenging when it's so difficult to find time to read, let alone read. But it's something that I found with an academic at the Open University Doreen Massey said many years ago, 20 years ago, she talked about how unusual it was for her to have the opportunity to reread something. So in her work, she was challenging a very pressured higher education environment 20 years ago or so. And we certainly have that problem now. And Yeah.
And I guess all of this, the rereading and hence slowing down, reflecting, allows for new ideas and concepts to be formed, and that's that space where new knowledge can be formed and we can progress.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are things to be thought about of how, for example, how the whole digital environment could support that type of reflection. So I'm working with Lynn McNair at the University of Edinburgh on a master's course on slow knowledge and the unhurried child. And one of the things we've suggested for students is to keep a slow journal. And that's a way of kind of saying, okay, how can you take on board these ideas, but also make the connections with your own childhood, your own experience of school, and the things that you're reading and rereading. And of course, a slow journal will look very different for different people. Some people it might be, a collage a week. Other people it'll be an online version. But I think there's things to be learnt about how we can do that.
And it's almost like a reflective journal, but then thinking back, like you said, to maybe your own childhood and thinking back further, like you said earlier, when you were talking about slow knowledge then, and thinking about, I guess, valuing the history as well.
Yeah.
This and this reminds me as well, something that I came up with on the Voice of Early Childhood platform to support current researchers and PhD students and even master's students is giving them the opportunity, and we've had a few on so far, giving them the opportunity to come onto the podcast and also write articles, but through a series of episodes and articles where we follow their journey. By we, I mean everyone who is listening and viewing in the early childhood community. So they get to share their research from the very beginning, even before they may have put forward their proposal and had their ethics approved and all these things. So actually, during the course of their research, they are sharing their plans, journey, insights that is really honouring the early childhood community, because that's saying, I want to take you on this journey with me, rather than I've done this research and it finished a year ago and now I'm publishing it and now you can get the insight. And actually maybe it's too late. I mean, it's not too late, but the impact of that research is a lot slower. It reaches children and educators a lot slower, but also they are not contributing to it in any way. So it allows people, as they listen, to potentially also get in touch and say, actually, have you thought about this? Or this makes me think this, and reflect together. And then that helps the researcher to reflect as well. And they've told me it's very much like having their own research journal, reflective journal on the way, but more verbal, visual, active. They're communicating all of this, and they've got new knowledge coming up as they're talking about their current findings. And then they say, oh, actually, I didn't even think about this. I've not even considered this once. I've not written this down anywhere. And I'll go back to my second stage of the research and change this and tweak that. So it is something, again, I guess that is what you described. That probably is that kind of slow, like journaling aspect as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it's almost like kind of adding a sort of ongoing engagement, almost a performance part of it, which
I guess
would kind of scare me personally. But I'm a private notebook person. But that's what I mean about hey, there might be different ways to do this. So I guess for me, this is around how to go from slow to deep, which is around opening up some of these complex questions, not just going for the simple, straightforward, fast forward. Yeah.
Yes, and when you mentioned slow to deep earlier on as well, I noted down, this sounded a little bit like you were talking about what we would also describe as project-based learning, project-based approach in early years, and very much, again, stemming from Reggio. So, and that is that giving children that opportunity to delve deeper into an area of interested topic, something that a project that they're going on.
I think so. And I just wonder whether actually in revisiting project work as a kind of really as such an engaged way of taking both children of both educators and children being able to go deeper. I think there's a lot of value in that, and can be the things that leave us with the strongest memories. I remember talking to one of the early years team in Orkney, where I'm based, and Amy was telling me how, several years later, it's the projects that she kind of keeps on remembering, and how children engage with the projects, and that stayed with her, and that's the things that she really enjoyed about her role. So I think that maybe ties up with our earlier conversation about enjoyment and bringing some of the fun back in.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, and we really do very much need it. And a lot of educators currently are talking about where is the joy gone from early childhood, and certainly under all the stresses and strains, that's how a lot of the sector are feeling. In the UK, in England especially, with everything going on, but very much so internationally as well.
I think it's internationally too. So that was what I was hearing in Australia and New Zealand, the problems with retention and recruitment. And I think it is a global issue, really. Yeah.
Well, I was going to mention one more thing. I don't want to kind of finish on a negative note, I guess. I was just going to mention one more thing that reminded me. I guess when you were talking about slowing, everything that you were talking about, really, but ergonomics, actually, the kind of thinking how do we design the life? How do we design spaces around us? How do we design systems, everything around us as humans, in order to allow us to slow down and therefore optimize for our well-being, and optimize for slowing down? It seems silly kind of saying optimize and slowing down in the same sentence, but you know what I mean. And that kind of made me think, again, one of the things I was saying, that how slow this concept of slow is so much bigger than it being kept in early years.
Yeah, no, it does. One of those ideas that just kind of mushrooms out. But so that fascinating idea around what does it mean in terms of the environments we create? So one of the early thoughts that I had around this idea of thinking more about slow was to think about, it was inspired by watching Norwegian educators work outdoors with children, and then thinking, okay, but what does this look like indoors? So I think that's partly around the environment. It's partly around how we work with the materials. So I've written and discussed were around, say, the use of clay and woodwork and sewing, and some of these activities and experiences that can hold time in a particular way, allow children to come back and develop and go deeper. So this idea of it, so it's partly, I think it's in the spaces that we create, it's in the things that we work with, and then it's also in the educator's skill, and that's all those different elements need to be there.
I'm just noting that down. I really love some of the few things that you said there, and especially around activities or materials that can hold time in a particular way. I love that. And the fact that it's about the spaces, the things we work with, and the educator skills. I think this is probably a nice way to wrap everything up.
So I just want to tell you about one little girl I met who
fantastic.
And they were they had a really strong kind of a really lively sewing corner. And I was introduced to this little girl and said, "Oh, she's the expert in long stitch." So basically, so this 4-year-old was the one who was really good at doing a particular kind of stitching, and the educators had kind of picked up on her love of sewing, and she kind of developed these skills over time. And then the setting had made, the children had decided that they wanted to make a birthday dress, which they worked on together, so that every time they had a birthday, then they put on the dress, which became a birthday cloak because the children decided that. But anyway, it was a lovely idea of children being experts. So we talked about and developing skills over time, and just educators who were really proud of what they've been doing and enjoyed their job.
And seeing that joy in the children's faces in their learning, and that progression of their project, I guess, rather than necessarily being bogged down in the progression of skills and outcomes and all these things.
Yeah.
That's really lovely. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I was conscious of your time because I know how busy you are, but I really, really love that you want to share so much about this. And it makes sense because it is, the work that you do and I guess your passion as well. And it's really lovely that you are sharing so much of this in such a deeper way as well, and not just, putting an idea out there and it's like a quick fix. Actually, this is the complete opposite with this, hence slow pedagogy.
Yeah. Very nice to talk to you, Angelica. Thank you for the invitation.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'll just say to all of our listeners and viewers that you can find out more on the Voice of Early Childhood website, including the really valuable Froebel Trust pamphlet by Professor Alison Clark and Donna Green. It's called Time for Childhood Slow Pedagogy. It's a very comprehensive 32-page document, which is get my words right, free to download. So everyone listening, you can sign up to the Voice of Early Childhood to get the PDF in your emails. So the link is in this episode description. You can just get it straight to your emails without any faff. So yes, very I feel very honoured, Alison, to have you on the podcast. As I said at the beginning, thank you so much for sharing this space with myself and the listeners, especially on our 100th episode. And thank you very much for your valuable work around the child's voice, research with children, and of course, slow pedagogy, which all continues to make that lasting impact on the early childhood sector and the wider community. So thank you, and thank you for sharing your voice.
Not at all. And happy birthday.